Hello everyone, today we talk about Amadeus VI, Count of Savoy, known as the Green Count for the distinctive emerald livery he adopted in youth and retained throughout his career as a deliberate visual marker of personal and household identity. In an era when the color-coded retinues signaled both allegiance and aspirational chivalric mobility, it's the later Italian Risorgimento that spotted in Savoyard history during the Middle Ages these three distinct figures that ended up overlapping, in fact, with the 19th century perspective, the colors of the Italian national flag. And so you have a white, a green, and a red count. At some point, we can actually complete this trio, so to say, and that are indeed very much, however, well documented as such as far as the color symbolism. It was never really conceptualized in the Middle Ages by the Savoyards, right? It was an accident, but based on actual historical evidence, as we'll learn at this point also about Amadeus. I was checking today my playlist and I realized that we have very few videos about Savoy. Both during the Middle Ages and the modern age. I made something recently about 18th century Savoyard warfare. We have a historical original episode about medieval Savoy as a wall. However, the dynasty of the Counts of Savoy is so important in the bigger picture, that is so important in medieval Western Alps between France and Italy, that it's really impossible to miss further. Thereby, we will probably also make more videos about Savoy. I have several videos about medieval Piedmont that, as you know, overlaps, right? The House of Savoy was essentially French, admittedly, historically, that was, if we have to force, of course, a modern national identity. There had been always a lot of contact across the Alps, the kingdoms of Italy, Burgundy, France, and Germany as well, for that matter. So there's a very interesting dynastic history in this, as you understand, also incredibly strategically meaningful position between the sort of the major kingdoms in the post-Carolingian Europe. When we look at the story, there is also probably a lot of territorial history, because as you understand, the very control of this or that valley acquires some greater relevance. The Savoyards ended up creating their own feudal state, their territorial principality, mostly in Piedmont, that would essentially become the regional force in modern times, from which eventually also the Italian unification was led from, a sort of Italian Prussia, right? If you have to transpose it for Germany, also due to their militarism, etc. It's a very interesting history, and it's definitely a rugged, mountainous landscape that definitely mirrors also the pretty brutal feudal military mindset we'll see today also as far as the Green Count is concerned. In fact, there is really a lot of stuff in here. I'm probably going to cover a couple of figures after the Green Count. I will not spoil which ones, but that have to do with the 14th century Crusades, that are actually a very interesting chapter against the Ottomans. Not talking Nicopolis at the end of that, also, as a matter of fact, at the end of the 14th century. And then, of course, the persecution in the 15th, and Crusades did not quite end until pretty late in time. But this mid-14th century era is sort of very unique on its own, in a world upside down, torn apart by Black Death, sort of polities collapsing, revolts, sort of Islamic resurgence in the East, and so on. It's an almost apocalyptic picture, and it's fascinating to see how entwined this various characters were across Europe, also by blood, right, dynastically speaking. So these were, as you know, pretty consistent high nobility in Europe, had really very far-reaching ties. In other words, we'll make lots of videos about Savoy, but today we stick to the Green Count, that, as we were just saying, as far as connections, was the eldest son of Count Aymon of Savoy and Yolande Paleologina of Montferrat, right? And herself, the daughter of Theodore I of Montferrat and Argentina Spinola, right? So we have a very interesting blend there of essentially this Franco-Burgundian background plus various Italian nobility, including the Palaiologoi of Montferrat. That is, I made, I think, only one video about Montferrat, but we never covered it in a regional sense. But as you know, at some point, it was this Byzantine rule with Theodore that had come over to Italy, also fought in local wars, eventually came back to the Byzantine Empire. But there was, in fact, also Greek blood running. Here you see also the connection with Genoa. If anything, it's an interesting parenthesis if you've never focused on that, also in the affairs of Piedmont in especially the early 14th century. It's really yet another very interesting page that we never really covered and that we are eager to anyway. Theodore I Palaiologos, just that we mentioned that the matter, had arrived in the West as a younger son of the Byzantine Emperor Andronicus II Palaiologos, who had reigned in Constantinople from 1282 until his forced abdication in 1328 amid civil wars, pretty, frequent to say the least, in Constantinople, and the gradual loss, in fact, also of Anatolian territories to Turkish beyliks. In Montferrat, after the extinction of the older Aleramic line in 1305 through the death without male heirs of Marquis John I, Theodore secured the Marquisate of Montferrat through a combination of imperial investiture by Henry VII of Luxembourg during the latter's Italian expedition of 1310-1313. I prepared an entire introduction to that, plus a series for each year of the war, of the expedition. It's sort of quite redeeming, sort of untangling, we'll be seeing this. In a series of strategic marriages that linked the Byzantine imperial house to the residual Aleramic holdings and the other sort of minor branches in Piedmont, thereby creating a unique cross-cultural bridge between the Eastern Mediterranean and the Western Alps that would later facilitate Savoyard involvement, in fact, in Byzantine affairs. This is what the Green Count is also mostly famous for during the 14th century, his successful crusade in the East, in a moment where, everything seemed not lost, but, say, very difficult to achieve to begin with. So you have this this act of bravery, but also faith, of commitment. It's a very important thing. It really makes you think why the medieval high nobility would be involved. It was actually a very prestigious thing to do, especially with the Byzantine connection. Now, the Marquisate of Montferrat is an important feudal state. In Italy, it's a province that endures its own originary imperial identity, so to say, imperial power delegation in a world of city-state, right, of communes. And so a force that was ideally different from the one of imperial hierarchy. Speaking of Amadeus' mother, instead, Yolande, born around 1318 in Moncalvo, brought into the Savoyard house a direct link to the Byzantine Palaiologos dynasty through her father. Thus, Yolande, born around 1318 in Moncalvo, brought into the Savoyard house a direct link to the Byzantine Palaiologos dynasty through her father. Moncalvo itself was a fortified hill town rising above the Tanner Valley in the very heart of the Montferrat, and had long served as a secondary residence for the marquises and a center for the production of high-quality wines, in particular, from the surrounding hills that sustained the local economy and supply, in fact, the courts of both Montferrat and neighboring Piedmontese lords, the vineyards yielding red wines from local grape varieties that were traded along the Po Valley routes. We're pretty florid principality in its niche, so to say. And when we look at the House of Savoy, we're looking a lot of stuff, as we anticipated. The House of Savoy was by far one of the oldest and noblest in Europe. Chambéry, on the obviously French side of the Alps, the traditional residence of the Savoyard counts since the late 12th century, when the dynasty shifted its primary seat from the older strongholds farther east, functioned as the political and administrative heart of the county in the Western Alps, right? It was a quote-unquote capital in anachronistic terms. Its castle complex and surrounding settlements providing both a fortified seat of power and a center for the growing administrative apparatus of the dynasty. Like a pretty sturdy Spartan mounted nobility. Like all these settlements are basically fortified with their domineering castles that prevent, in fact, any power to simply sort of walk in without their consent, and sort of they're very difficult to simply seize. There are admittedly, some enemies of Savoy, such as, for example, the same Dauphiné. There are very interesting wars that are fought at the beginning of the 14th century. We could make videos about that. I talked a bit about the Dauphiné if you're interested in it. Chambéry's position at the confluence of routes of the Maurienne, the Tarentaise, and the Genevois allowed the Count of Savoy to monitor both Transalpine commerce and the movements of neighboring powers with unusual efficiency, while the castle itself expanded under earlier counts into a complex of halls and towers overlooking the Lys Valley, already housing the nascent chancery and archives that would become essential to the concentrating efforts of Amadeus's later reign. Those archives, carefully maintained by professional notaries trained in the Roman law tradition that had spread northward from the Italian universities in the 13th century, preserved charters dating back to the 11th, and formed, in fact, a documentary foundation for later claims to imperial privileges granted by successive Holy Roman emperors, recognizing Savoyard rights over Alpine passes and feudal jurisdiction. This is something we have in Europe, while some bigger cities in the lowlands at the head of the most important states were historically routinely at some point conquered, sacked. There were fires. They were sort of more dynamic and more subject to destruction. So massive archives, right? Also during recent wars, as you understand, when destroyed with enormous loss in the history of mankind, these more remote outposts, say, of civilization, Persian, this pretty grim, but also very beautiful mountains, would manage to preserve much of their original sources, right, and escape much of the devastations that instead happened to more developed centers. Amadeus's mother died in December 1342 while awaiting the birth of a fifth child, having first dictated a will that directed her burial at the Abbey of Hautecombe, that, as you know, is the mausoleum of the House of Savoy, and left bequests to her surviving children, including Amadeus as firstborn, right, so his, obviously, the expected heir, his brother John, his sister Blanche, and any posthumous son. The will also contained careful provisions for the spiritual welfare of her soul, reflecting the intense Marian devotion characteristic of mid-14th century princely households, in which masses, alms, and the intercession of the Virgin were regarded as essential safeguards against the uncertainties of the afterlife, with specific numbers of masses often stipulated for particular feast days, but pretty traditional. The Abbey of Hautecombe, we were just remembering it, it was founded by the early counts of Savoy on the shores of Lake Bourget, serving as the principal dynasty, the principal dynastic necropolis, and a major Cistercian house, as well, whose spiritual prestige reinforced the comital family's claims to pious legitimacy across the Alpine region. Founded in 1125 by Amadeus III under the influence of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux himself, who had personally encouraged the establishment of Cistercian houses as centers of reform and prayer. We've seen it also in the recent video about Louis VII of France. The abbey's white-robed monks maintained continuous liturgical commemoration of the Savoyard dead, thereby weaving the dynasty's memory to the broader Cistercian network that stretched from Burgundy to Piedmont, and ensuring that the counts remain present in the prayers of a transnational monastic order. Lake Bourget, the largest natural lake entirely within the later boundaries of France, provided both a defensive barrier and a reliable source of fish that supported the monastic community through lean years, its waters yielding pike, trout, and other species harvested under rites carefully regulated by the abbey's charters. Right, these were quite prelibate praise for especially an economy that is just stand up mountain is also more primitive, more natural based. Now, 6 months after Amadeus's mother death, on June the 22nd, 1343, Aemon himself died at Montmelian after a sudden illness, having confirmed in his own testament of June the 11th that the succession should pass to Amadeus, failing him to John, and thereafter to the cousins Louis II of Savoy. It was yet the other sort of important branch of the House of Savoy. At some point was also against the main one, while requesting burial at the same abbey of Hautecombe as per tradition. Aymon's testament carefully balanced the claims of the direct line against those of the collateral vote branch that, as we've seen, was really necessary as a precaution that would prove crushing in preventing fragmentation during the minority of Amadeus, and that reflected the Count's awareness of the dangers posed by the partitioned inheritance patterns common among Alpine dynasties that obviously had the sort of much easier job, but also entrenching themselves in their mountain castles, and where cadette lines thus often retained substantial independent territories. Montmelian was a strategically sited fortress town controlling routes through the lower Isère valley, had long been a key defensive point for Savoy against pressures from the Dauphiné in the west and the Kingdom of France. Its castle perched on a rocky spur above the confluence of the Isère and the Arc commanded the principal road linking, in fact, Chambéry and the Maurienne and the Mont-Cenis pass, making it indispensable for both military mobilization and the collection of tolls on Transalpine trade. The tolls levied at Montmelian on salt, cloth, and livestock formed one of the steadiest sources of comital revenue throughout the 14th century, the salt in particular coming from the saline deposits of the lower Rhone and the cloth from the manufacturing centers of Flanders and northern Italy. The 9-year-old heir at the time therefore inherited under a regency established by his father's will and composed of the two cousins, Louis II of Vaud and Amadeus II of Geneva, who were obliged to render account to a council of feudal representatives drawn from the several regions of the county. The requirement of regular accounting to a representative council marked an early step toward institutionalizing the relationship between the comital house and its principal vassals, an arrangement that anticipated later developments in representative assemblies across the Western Alps. Louis II, Baron of Vaud, held extensive lands along the northern shore of Lake Geneva and that had been detached from the main Savoyard inheritance in the 13th century through the partition arranged after the death of Count Thomas I, while Amadeus III of Geneva controlled the strategically vital, in fact, Genevois and the approaches to the Rhone as well. You understand how important these places really were. They controlled different watersheds towards majorly important European areas. Their joint regency therefore balanced the northern and western extremities of the comital domain as well, where obviously Amadeus's power mostly concentrated in the larger sort of core and especially the Italian possessions. The Genevois, with its dense network of fortified villages and its control of the upper Rhone crossings, gave Amadeus III a crucial voice in any negotiations involving the city of Geneva itself, for example, whose commercial importance and communal institutions made it a perennial object of Savoyard ambition. There was some intermittent control, right? The city's merchants handling the transit of goods between the Italian plain and the fairs of Champagne. The County of Savoy at this date comprised, therefore, a mosaic of Alpine valleys, the Piedmontese foothills and Transalpine enclaves, whose cohesion depended on the careful balancing of local feudal customs with the emerging authority of the central comital court. Local customs varied sharply from valley to valley, with some communities retaining the right to elect their own syndics, while others remained under the direct authority of appointed castellans. A diversity that required constant negotiation if the count were to exercise effective rule. The syndics, often drawn from the leading free families who administered communal pastures and forests according to customary law codes written in local Romance dialects. The regents immediately secured recognition of the young count, Amadeus, from the vassals, obtained the customary religious privileges from the papacy, because this was an international matter, and confronted the renewed claims of Joan of Savoy. It was the daughter of the earlier Count Edward and wife of the Duke of Brittany, among other things. I talked a bit about the influence of the Savoyards at the court of Henry III, Edward I, Edward II. They were, again, also very highly admire military leaders. Like if you look at especially the French armies and the various clashes against, at some point, both the Flemish and the Swiss. We were just talking about these things yesterday, even though we didn't mention the Savoyards. We should make a video about this. They were essentially some of the most favorite figures, right, to rely on from the side of the French monarchy, without mentioning that Henry VII of Luxembourg had pretty much been cited by the Count of Savoy, that was also close controlling his apartments in the camp during the Italian expedition. And we've seen before, these were very, again, competent, right, authoritative, prestigious, admired figures in the broader Western European political landscape. Here we see Joan's marriage into the Breton ducal house, which had given her a powerful French protector and a claim that could not be dismissed lightly, especially at a moment when the Valois monarchy was consolidating its hold over the western approaches to the Alps as well. There was always this ambiguity, and this was technically the Kingdom of Burgundy, so we're talking actually Holy Roman Empire, also from the other side of the Alps. That, however, the Holy Roman emperors were not really in the political, physical, territorial capacity to simply assert a dominance in. The videos about the Dauphiné really explain fairly well what the juridical, international, local ambiguity of these encroachments. Naturally, this was also a relatively difficult time for everybody in the 30s, the 40s. As you know, the world slows down, and France will be engulfed in the 100 Years' War without capacity of broader territorial recomposition for a long time. But this is also what, as we'll see now, will favor, paradoxically, a secondary power like Savoy. Although Joan had formally renounced her rights in a treaty of 1339 with Aymon, the instrument had never been fully applied. This is also the age, again, of the English claims on the French throne. There is all this debate surrounding the Salic law, and the broader possibility, of course, of female inheritance, whatever. Upon her death in 1344, she bequeathed the claim on whatever she could sort of demand from Savoy to Philip of Orléans. It was the son of the same French king. Philip of Orléans was the younger son, in fact, of Philip VI. He had already held substantial appanages and represented a direct Valois interest in the Alpine frontier. In the 20s, there had been a major French expedition in alliance with the Angevins of Provence, etc., into Lombardy. So we're not talking about merely sort of distant threats. At this point, again, things will slow down. But dynastic claims, right, to the various thrones were about to become such a central theme, especially in French politics, right? There was this interest, of course, in the Alpine frontier, making the settlement of Joan's claim a matter of urgent diplomatic priority for the regency in Savoy as well. The regents therefore negotiated a settlement that yielded 2 castles, so it was a compromise fundamentally, an annual pension of £2,000, and the promise of a military contingent against the English, right? Because, again, Savoy had always somehow cooperated with France, had been really on the front lines, also profiting, right, as we've seen, general political opportunities, clientele relations, etc., with the French crown. This compromise successfully forestalled the absorption of the Savoyard state into the French monarchy at the very moment when the Dauphiné was moving toward the same destiny instead. Right, Savoy naturally develops into a power. The Dauphiné sort of gets lost a bit into history, just as the whole Kingdom of Burgundy at the end of the day. The pension, payable in stable French currency, constituted a heavy financial commitment for the regency at a time when local revenues were still recovering from earlier wars and the demographic shocks that would soon follow. But it also preserved Amadeus's position, like the entire Savoyard establishment, and especially spared them from a French invasion that was definitely feasible, especially if using the Dauphiné as a proxy. Right, the Dauphiné was this extensive territory of the former counts of Albon that stretched from the Rhone to the Alps and had become a major object of French royal ambition precisely because its acquisition would give the Valois kings a continuous frontier with Savoy and control over the important Alpine passes leading into Italy. We partially talked about this area also as far as 17th century warfare, the Valdensian resistance. They're very interesting frontier area also in the later wars between France and Savoy, etc. Like it had always remained during the centuries. Control of the Dauphiné would also give the French crown direct access to the salt routes of the Upper Rhone and the iron deposits of the Ouessant, resources that had long underpinned the economic independence of the Alpine principalities, the iron being extracted from high-altitude mines and worked into tools and weapons. Humbert II, last independent Dauphin of the House of La Tour du Pin, had inherited, this is before the Dauphiné became the actual Dauphiné, so the appanage for the kings of France, just like the Prince of Wales for the English, right? He also made a video about Louis XI, a couple of videos that explained how he was effectively actually the only Dauphin that ever ruled from there to begin with. Eventually it remained just the name was maintained because this province was in theory the appanage of the presumptive heir, the King of France, the firstborn. But the sense is that in any case nobody really went there. Also because it was a total mess. It was an incredibly fragmented place with so many different lords that had failed at confederating. In fact, the death of Humbert II, we've also seen it in the video about the Dauphiné, brought about sort of the shipwrecking of this, the independence of the principality, but also because its bases were very fragile, right? The Savoyards, paradoxically, had a much better footing at this point. Humbert II, in particular, had inherited the principality already burdened by the debts of earlier wars and by the failure of his own line after the death of his only son. Right, his decision to sell, rather than it's a bit of a complicated story. That's why I sent you to that video that I already made. Then see the lands fragmented among collateral relatives, which was the most painful thing for everybody. They preferred foreign dynasties to local branches, even of the same blood, because those would have destroyed what they had tried to keep so hardly together. It's like, I don't know why the Hauteville, there were many different branches of the Hauteville in Sicily. They decided to marry with the Hohenstaufen for that very reason, right, to maintain more unitary control. And in this case, it naturally much smaller reality, but it reflected both personal exhaustion and the systemic vulnerability of smaller Alpine principalities. At different times, the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor had sort of dealt with sort of these lands and trying to make some agreements. At some point, the Imperials wanted even to sell this land itself. In any case, the House of La Tour du Pin had arisen through careful marriage alliances in previous centuries, military service to the empire. By the mid-14th century, its resources were insufficient to sustain independent sovereignty in the face of Valois pressure in particular. Humbert II, we mentioned him, was Humbert of Viennois, right? The last of the House of La Tour du Pin, and burdened by debts in particular incurred during an earlier crusade. They had already begun negotiations for the cession of his principality. The Savoyard regents sought to prevent the transfer by offering Blanche of Savoy in marriage, together with a dowry of 120,000 florins, a project briefly attracting papal mediation under Clement VI. This would have naturally largely increased Savoyard power, also allowing it to defend itself better from the west, from French encroachments. Blanche, still a child at the time of the proposed match, represented the most valuable marriageable asset the regency possessed, and the size of the proposed dowry indicates the seriousness with which the Savoyard Council viewed the threat of French expansion. Clement VI elected at Avignon, because remember, these are also close places with the Avignonese papacy to the Curia itself, in 1342, after a long career as a diplomat and scholar, viewed the Alpine principalities as a buffer zone whose independence helped preserve papal freedom of maneuver between the French crown and the Italian communes. His earlier experience as a papal legate in the service of John the 22nd, one of the most sort of intact and inflexible popes, also one who would invest millions of florins in actual warfare and campaigns of conquest, have given him an intimate knowledge of the complex politics of the Western Alps and of the delicate balance required to keep any single secular power from dominating the approaches to Italy in particular, because they obviously were aiming from Avignon to preserve also the papal states in a time in which, in fact, there wouldn't be many invasions like Charles IV would descend at different times. We made videos about him. But naturally, this very central position of Avignon in Europe allowed the popes to sort of meddle the affairs of different regions simultaneously. Clement VI, the Avignon pope elected, as we've seen in 1342, pursued therefore this policy of active diplomatic intervention in the affairs of Western Alpine principalities, seeking both to maintain papal influence and to prevent any single secular power from dominating the approaches to Italy. French pressure compelled Humbert to abandon the match with Blanche, though. The definitive act of cession was signed at Romans on March the 3rd, 1349, and solemnly executed at Lyon on July the 16th, after which Humbert retired into a Dominican monastery. Romans, a flourishing commercial town on the Isère, provided a neutral setting for the final negotiations between the Dauphin and the French crown, while the subsequent ceremony at Lyon underscored the public character of the transfer and the irrevocability of the new arrangement. The price paid by Philip VI was 400,000 écus, together with an annual pension, and the critical clause stipulated that Dauphiné should thereafter be held by the heir to the French throne as a distinct appanage rather than absorbed into the royal domain, a provision that preserved its administrative identity while placing it firmly under Valois control. And so the Savoyards remain without Dauphiné. The écu, as you know, speaking of currency, was a gold coin of high purity struck to a standard that made it acceptable across much of Western Europe, represented a substantial transfer of bullion that strained the French treasury at a moment of intense military expenditure in the war against England. Yet the strategic gain of a continuous Alpine frontier was judged to outweigh the immediate fiscal cost as well. Just for telling you how potentially endowed the House of Savoy really is. The new arrangement stipulated that therefore the Dauphiné should always be governed by the heir to the French throne rather than by a cadet, thereby placing a powerful royal neighbor along nearly one-third of Savoy's western frontier and extinguishing any realistic prospect of further expansion beyond the Alps. Right? Already at this point, like Savoy was more turned toward Italy, but its more important possessions laid on the Italian side of the watershed. But in perspective, like the expansion in the Dauphiné would have made Savoy even a more powerful polity, like it wouldn't actually become for generations on the western side of the Alps. Concurrently, the Black Death, having already ravaged Florence and the Italian ports from which it had come from the east, crossed the mountains in 1348 and halved the population of many Alpine villages. Contemporary chronicles record that entire hamlets in the upper Maurienne and the Tarentaise were left deserted, their fields reverting to scrub within a single generation, while the disruption of labor and fiscal bases forced the regions to confront simultaneous demographic collapse and political insecurity. You can imagine how more fragile like mountain economy really was, much less surplus, and so how easy it was even for certain areas to go depopulated due to this terrible illness. The pandemic, which reached the Alpine valleys after devastating the Mediterranean trading cities, disrupted both the labor force available for military service and the fiscal base of the comital administration as well. Because a great deal of their income, yes, was from international trade crossing the Alpine valleys, but mostly was based on the hard stock of local pastures, production, right, cattle breeding, and so on. if this is shattered, it's a total mess. Popular belief attributed the contagion to the poisoning of wells by Jews, although certain castellans attempted to protect them, as it was actually customary in the Middle Ages. Mobs at Chambéry forced the synods to demand an inquiry modeled on earlier proceedings in the Dauphiné. I had also witnessed these episodes. The inquiry procedure itself followed models already, in fact, tested, where similar accusations had produced mass executions 2 years earlier, and the confessions extracted under torture at Chillon and other lakeside castles, alleging a coordinated plot organized by rabbis from Toledo and elsewhere, were rapidly circulated by letter to neighboring towns, fueling a wave of violence that swept from Lake Geneva into the Swiss plateau and the Rhine Valley. Chillon, the island fortress controlling the narrow passage between the lake and the mountains, had long served as a secure place of detention for high-value prisoners as well. The Jews were first confined in the castle for safety, then transferred to the town prisons, where a crowd broke in and massacred several. The survivors were condemned, 11 executed, and the remainder subjected to a fine of 160 florins monthly for 6 years. Just imagine being Amadeus and being brought up in this kind of climate, right, in general. Similar violence, by the way, occurred at Jenne, Aiguebelle, and Seyssel, with the confiscation of Jewish property, while the young count later ordered himself the hanging of 3 bourgeois of Chambéry for having usurped judicial authority in the affair. Yen, situated on the Rhone opposite the Bugey, had long been a secondary market for salt, the aforementioned salt trade between the Jura and the Alpine valleys and its Jewish communities, like those of Aiguebelle and Seyssel. It had provided essential short-term credit to wine growers and cattle dealers so that their destruction simultaneously removed a fiscal resource and disrupted the seasonal credit cycles on which rural markets depended. The fine imposed on the surviving Jews at Chambéry was collected with unusual rigor, providing the Regency with an unexpected windfall at a moment of fiscal crisis. Amadeus received an education in all this that combined physical training in arms and horsemanship with the study of classical and contemporary texts, among them Vegetsus's De Re Militari and Gilles of Rome's De Regimine Principum. Right, so a classical military treaty and a Speculum Principum. His tutors included both clerical scholars trained at the University of Paris and experienced knights who had served in the Italian campaigns of the previous generation, ensuring that the young count absorbed both the theoretical frameworks of late medieval political thought and the practical lessons of contemporary warfare, right? There was something legendary about, in fact, that the previous decades, especially Henry VII's expedition, the connection with the Count of Savoy. The Savoyards had fought in Rome at the Incisa Pass. They had led the Germans to break the Guelph blockade of the valley. There is really a lot behind it. Savoyard involved also in Switzerland, in Flanders. So you can imagine also these men at arms, like, looking at this kid and say, this is to be the next hero of our house. Like, we have also to bring an adequate level of awareness of identity. Not that, of course, this milieu lacked it, right? Vegetsus's 4th century compilation, still copied in dozens of manuscripts across 14th century Europe, supplied concrete prescriptions for recruitment, training, and logistics that princes could adapt to the mixed feudal and mercenary forces of their own day. Amadeus's grandfather, Theodore of Montferrat, had himself actually written a military treatise in Latin while he was in Italy, so also influenced by the experience in local warfare, pretty much similarly to, in fact, the Byzantine tradition that, as you know, had more than Vegetsus for that matter. It's quite interesting read. If anything, we can read the texts, but for telling you also how what kind of military intellect, right, Amadeus was coming from in a broader sense. Vegetsus's late Roman treatise on military organization remained it was fundamentally the only military manual read in the West, because it was in Latin. It was a standard handbook for 14th century princes still seeking to professionalize their forces, while Gilles of Rome's Mirror for Princes offered a scholastic framework for the moral and political education of a Christian ruler. Gilles' text, originally composed for the Capetian court, had by the 1340s become a common possession of princely libraries from the Low Countries to the Mediterranean. Gilles, writing around 1280 for the future Philip IV of France, where the peak there of the French monarchy, integrated Aristotelian ethics with Augustinian political theology, producing a text that circulated widely in both Latin and vernacular versions and shaped the self-image of many late medieval rulers as guardians of justice and defenders of the faith. Amadeus's personal piety expressed itself in the request for a portable altar, in the privilege that his chaplain might celebrate Mass wherever he happened to be. He also undertook vows of fasting more rigorous than his health could sustain, until Clement VI released him from them on condition that he feed 12 of the poor each week. The portable altar, a rare privilege granted only to the highest nobility, by the way, allowed the count to maintain the full liturgical cycle even during prolonged campaigns far from any permanent chapel, reinforcing the sacral character of his authority as well in the eyes of his subjects and allies, right? We don't digress in the theology here because this video is already too long the way it is, but the idea in that there was a special connection with the divinity. You could not always be on consecrated soil. I think about during the Crusades, as a matter of fact. This also shows Amadeus's spiritual training, the understanding of ascesis, of mental fortification in front of adversities. Early marriage negotiations reflected the diplomatic currents of the time as well. In 1337, ambassadors of John of Bohemia, right? This is the son of Henry VII and the father of Charles IV, right? As you know, the blind king of Bohemia that died almost with his own son, by the way, at the Battle of Crécy, right? Together with the French nobility, proposed at this point a betrothal to Margaret, that was the daughter of the future Emperor Charles IV. A formal treaty was drafted the following year, but was never executed. Margaret, still an infant at the time of the proposal, represented a potential link to the rising Luxembourg dynasty that would soon control both Bohemia and the empire, and John of Bohemia, already blind and campaigning across half of Europe, from literally Italy to Lithuania, from France to in fact to Germany, sought to construct a network of marital alliances. It would secure Luxembourg influence from the Baltic to the Mediterranean and counterbalance both French and Habsburg ambitions at this point. Essentially, the Luxembourgs were still making leverage on the Rhone Valley principalities of the empire, right? Distant, but again, with this Savoyard connection still handleable, right? Exactly trying to stamp French expansionism at this point. There's a pretty complicated picture here that I'm not going to digress on, especially northern Italy. In any case, between 1340 and 1344, Amadeus was contracted to Joanne of Bourbon, niece of Philip VI, with a projected dowry of 50,000 florins. That engagement was later set aside, however. Joanna was a member of a junior Capetian line, brought with her the possibility of closer integration into the French royal network of alliances, yet the match was ultimately abandoned as Savoyard diplomacy shifted toward other opportunities. In fact, in 1347, a new contract bound Amadeus to Joan of Burgundy instead, daughter of the deceased Philip of Burgundy, and eventual heiress of the duchy. The 3-year-old princess was brought to Savoy to be raised according to local custom. Joan's upbringing at the Savoyard court included instruction in the local Romance dialect as well as the formal French of the Valois court, because essentially this was a southern Occitanian land, preparing her for a role that would have placed Savoy at the center of Burgundian succession politics. The arrangement alarmed the French court, though, which already contemplated the absorption of Burgundy upon the extinction of its Capetian line. Under pressure from John II, the betrothal was finally annulled in 1355 in return for an indemnity of 40,000 florins and the promise that Amadeus would neither marry an English princess nor pursue the Burgundian inheritance. This is very interesting because You could have literally had a Burgundy eventually ending up in the hands of Savoy again. There are so many possibilities that there are very early stories also with these lands. If you look at the origin of the County of Savoy, so that the part of the county of Burgundy, that remained in the Burgundian kingdom as opposed to the duchy that developed separately. There was also Savoy in between. This is very interesting. We're talking the 10th century. Magnificent story. In fact, Joanna, by the way, is the grand aunt of Philip of Ruf, who would actually could become, having died of 50 in an accident or of a plague, the actual great inheritor of a larger Burgundian state, including Flanders. It's a very complex matter, but there was definitely the possibility of a Savoyard involvement in Burgundy as well. And remember, the Savoyards were pretty much out there. Historically, they had been a very strong presence all across, so as, again, commanders in the French army, the French world in these frontiers, so they had some important support there as well. The aforementioned indemnity, by the way, shows how also, of course, important the Burgundian commitments were. It was paid in installments, helped offset the enormous costs already incurred in the Faucigny campaign, while the French insistence on the annulment reflected the strategy, because, of course, the Savoyards at that point had also started investing themselves in Burgundy, reflected the strategic importance attached to preventing any independent power from controlling both sides of the Jura Mountains. We'll talk more about Savoyard and Burgundian warfare during this earlier phase of the 14th century. I made a video about, of course, the Valois-Burgundy warfare, a couple of videos from beginning to end, but there is all a very interesting history prior to that as well. The Duchy of Burgundy, whose Carpathian line was approaching extinction, represented a prize of such magnitude that its potential union with Savoy threatened to create a powerful independent state controlling both sides of the Jura and the approaches to the Middle Rhone. The prospect of such Savoyard-Burgundian bloc spanning the Alpine and Jura frontiers would have interrupted the continuous Valois corridor from Paris to the Mediterranean. Remember that they are the Angevins in southern Italy, and there is therefore also a pretty big interest. There are French noblemen, there are also vassals of the Kingdom of Sicily, etc. So, Kingdom of Naples, if you prefer. And so, here, Savoy, that is part of the empire and has these historical ties to, in fact, the Holy Roman Emperors as well, is a bit of a problem, right? This forced the French crown to confront a rival of nearly equal resources, had, or at least all these territories being put together, danger openly acknowledged by contemporary French chroniclers even. By 1350, the young Count Amadeus began to take a more active part in the deliberation of the council. That year, he concluded a mutual defense treaty with Amadeus of Geneva, James of Piedmont, and the Visconti of Milan, sealing the understanding by the marriage of his sister Blanche to Galeazzo Visconti. This was a very big marriage as well, right? The Visconti will also tie themselves with the French, to the Valois house. They were by far the biggest power in northern Italy, in the Italic kingdom. And so this was a massive alliance, right? Milan was also close. It had historically actually fought. The Savoyards in Piedmont had managed to conquer some communes that the Savoyards had seized. The dowry paid by the bridegroom was converted into castles held in fief by the Milanese lord in the Po Valley. Right? The conversion of the dowry into fiefs rather than a simple cash payment created a permanent territorial link thereby between the two houses and reflected the Visconti's need for secure alpine routes, both for commercial access to the Champagne fairs and for the movement of troops against their remaining Guelph opponents in the region. There's a very complicated story here. We'll only partially see it now, as it partially has to do with the matter, right? But that's why we need to make a big video about Piedmontese warfare during the first half of the 14th century. In honor of the alliance, Amadeus instituted the Order of the Black Swan. As we will see also in other videos soon, like this is a notorious moment in which the higher nobility of Europe establishes some significant chivalric orders that are meant to create this hard core of loyal men-at-arms, all imbued with a high sense of sacrifice, self-sacrifice in holy combat. Here, the Black Swan is a rare heraldic device. It was chosen to symbolize both the exotic nature of the new Italian connection and the fidelity expected of the knights, marking an early experiment in the creation of princely orders that would later find fuller expression in the Order of the Collar. The Visconti, having consolidated control over Milan, Pavia, and much of western Lombardy after the fall of the Della Torre house, needed secure alpine routes for commercial access to, as we've seen before, French markets in particular, and for continuing to operate in Piedmont. So it was the best solution at the moment. Galeazzo Visconti's personal ambition extended far beyond Lombardy, encompassing designs on the remaining independent communes of Piedmont, for that matter, and Liguria. It would eventually bring him into war once again, into conflict with Savoyard interests, but not at this point. The same period witnessed the first of several campaigns in the Valais as well. Guichard Tavel, Bishop of Sion, and a Savoyard ally, attempted to assert rights over certain nobles. When he and his followers were attacked in August 1351, Clement VI excommunicated the rebels, and Amadeus dispatched 30 knights. Bishop Tabel, a native of the Genevois, had been appointed with strong Savoyard support and remained a reliable ally throughout the decade, providing the Count Amadeus with a useful ecclesiastical foothold in the upper Rhone valley. 8,000 peasants rose in response and seized several castles. A further 100 knights restored order. That's how you restore order at this point in history. And remember, this is the same years of different disorders, peasant uprisings, repressions of sort of heretical fringes. There's going to be the Jacquerie in a while. And in this mountainous eras, like there is a less stratified society, right? It's sort of much more brutally, as we've seen, feudal one. At the same time, the peasantry also has its own manpower. In March 1352, Amadeus assembled a larger force that included Amadeus of Geneva and John of Montferrat. John, himself a member of the Palaeologan line through his mother, brought both military experience and a personal interest in the stability of the western Alpine frontier, reinforcing the dynastic ties that linked Savoy to Montferrat. Right? Having a strong Savoy meant sort of less problems from the Milanese and other actors. The rebels yielded at that point, and Amadeus re-established thus the authority over Sion that his uncle Edward had previously lost. A second rising later the same year compelled him, however, to divert an army intended for the Dauphiné, because there was a hot front as well. On November the 3rd, Amadeus defeated the insurgents, was knighted the following morning by his advisor William, ordered part of the city wall demolished, allowed his troops to pillage, and imposed heavy fines. All right, pretty typically iron-fisted Savoyard attitude. The deliberate demolition of sections of the wall naturally served both as a punitive measure and as a practical means of preventing future resistance, while the heavy fines replenished the comital treasury after the costs of the campaign itself. Pretty serious matters he had to rule, to give the example with such harsh provisions. The Valais is the upper Rhone valley controlled in theory at this point by the Bishop of Sion. It was in practice, however, a patchwork of German-speaking peasant communities whose resistance to episcopal and Savoyard authority repeatedly flared into open revolt throughout the mid-14th century. Right? There's all a tension that will increasingly rise between Savoy and the Swiss, as we're remembering before. But it's interesting because these communities organized in loosely federated valleys, assemblies, and speaking Alemannic dialects, because they had settled there, as you know, in the late 5th century, right after they had been displaced by the Franks from upper north, had long resisted the imposition of Romance-speaking officials and the commutation of customary services into cash rents. And their customary law codes differed markedly from the Roman-influenced practices of the lower Savoyard lands. with all these valleys one after the other. At a certain point, people change, languages change. At a point, they're important as linguistic barriers, even though they're pretty similar peoples as they neighboring each other. In the summer of 1352, Hugh of Geneva, uncle of the Genevan count, and a noble of the Dauphiné, reopened the long-standing frontier feud. Amadeus of Geneva, feeling his honor compromised by an earlier treaty, left the Regency Council and challenged William de Le Bon. William, a trusted Savoyard councillor of long standing, had been instrumental in the earlier negotiations that limited Genevan independence, and his presence as a target of challenge underscored the personal character of many Alpine frontier disputes. On June the 6th, Amadeus of Savoy formed an alliance with Albert II of Austria, known as the Lame, ruling the Habsburgic lands in Austria, Styria, and Carinthia, in sharing with Savoy a common interest in containing both French expansion westward and the centrifugal pretensions of the smaller Alpine counts. His physical disability did not prevent him from conducting an active foreign policy that sought to stabilize the western approaches to the Habsburg domains. Even if the Habsburgs ruled in the Eastern Alps and had their problems, as seen also with the Luxembourgs that were allied with the House of Savoy, and they had also possessions in their native Swabian lands, and so they tended to back their an interesting political pawn that could sort of stem French expansionism in toward the east. After suppressing the renewed Valais rising, Amadeus turned against Hugh, besieged Gers from October 26th to November 11th, 1353, burned the town, and continued operations until the following April, when he destroyed Hugh's army near Les Abres. Gers, a small but strategically placed lordship controlling the approaches to the Jura passes, had long been a source of friction between Savoy and the Genevan house, and its temporary occupation demonstrated the Count's determination to secure the northern frontier. King John II, anxious to exploit both Savoyard and Dauphinois forces against the English in Gascony, imposed a truce. I made a video about John II, King of France, if you're interested in his life and reign. But Hugh immediately violated it. The definitive settlement came with the Treaty of Paris of January 5th, 1355. Amadeus surrendered his ancient enclaves in the Viennois, beyond the Rhone and Guiers, territories that included fortified places such as Voiron, Le Côte Saint-André, and Saint-Georges d'Espérange, and received in exchange undisputed sovereignty over Faucigny and Gers, together with suzerainty over the counts of Geneva. The surrender enclaves had become increasingly difficult to defend once the Dauphiné passed under French control, and the exchange rationalized, therefore, the western frontier by eliminating isolated Savoyard pockets deep inside the newly French Dauphiné, while also consolidating a continuous territorial corridor from the Genevois through Faucigny to the core of Savoy. Right. This was a bit typical of the era. There is a further sort of regionalization, like rationalization of the various territorial holdings into some more compact domains, the exhaustion of the great medieval civilizations, especially with the plague and so on. The same instrument confirmed the rupture of the Burgundian betrothal and bound Amadeus to assist the French king against England, however. And we are at the height of the first phase, right, the Edwardian phase of the war. Faucigny was the Alpine lordship link between the Havre and the Gifre valleys, had long been contested between Savoy and the Dauphiné. The definitive acquisition gave the Count a continuous territorial corridor linking the Genevois to the heart of Savoy. The Arve Valley, with its rich pastures and control of the routes toward the Mont Blanc Massif, represented a particularly valuable acquisition, yet occupation of Faucigny still required force, as local feudatories resisted with covert French encouragement at the same time. So it was not an agreement in good faith, as much as also the French king was trying to distract Savoy and demanding actual support against the English. The 3-month campaign of March-June 1355, culminating in the capture of the castle of Hermance. Hermance, a lakeside fortress on the southern shore of Lake Geneva, controlled both the water route and the coastal road linking the Genoa to Chablais in its full marked the effective completion of Savoyard control over the new corridor. A residual frontier dispute over which the two Guiers torrents should form the boundary remained unresolved until the 18th century. In 1355, Amadeus married Bonne of Bourbon, daughter of Duke Peter I and Isabella of Valois, and therefore sister-in-law of the future Charles V of France. Isabella of Valois' sister Philip VI brought the marriage into the innermost circle of the French royal family, while Bonne, born in 1341, brought not only Capetian blood but also the practical experience of a French princely household that would prove invaluable during Amadeus's prolonged absences. Her household accounts, carefully preserved at the Historical Archive of Turin, reveal a systematic approach to the management of both ordinary and extraordinary revenues, demonstrating a capacity for independent governance that few contemporary princesses matched. Savoyard contingents under Amadeus's personal command accompanied the French royal army in Artois, northeastern France, though fortune kept Amadeus distant from the catastrophe of Poitiers the following year. In fact, I made an entire video about the battle. I recently again started a series on the broader strategic eventuality of the 100 Years' War. The Artois campaign of 1355 tested the logistical capacity of the Savoyard forces operating far from their Alpine bases, even though, of course, they were supported by the French crown. And in the aftermath of John II's defeat at Poitiers, in particular, flooded the Alpine passes with demobilized soldiers in free companies whose presence would continue to disrupt the region for years. This is the age of free companies of soldiers of fortune, especially after the later Treaty of Bretigny, laws would be let loose, and they started systematically devastating, especially France, right? But many of them entered Italy, and obviously they had to pass through the Alps as well. So pretty delicate situation. Naturally, Poitiers causes an immense perturbation of all French affairs. The king is captured, great part of the nobility is killed and captured as well. There's this both social upheaval because of the astronomical ransom that must be paid. There is the Jacquerie. So it's a fortune for the Savoyards to be perched on their Alpine castles, seeing this from the distance. In 1359, the extinction of the male line of Savoy-Vaud allowed Amadeus to purchase the barony from his cousin Catherine, widow of Azzo Visconti, that I also made an entire video on, by the way. This is one of the greatest commanders of his era, and of Raoul of Brienne, and then wife of William of Namur, who's in Belgium, as you know, for 160,000 gold florins. The acquisition linked Bresse, Gers, and the northern lanes into a continuous block and recovered the Var-Romée and Bourget. Right, these areas were very feudal, were very important tournaments held, especially in Bourg-en-Bresse. And there's a lot of very interesting tradition. The places are beautiful. Like I had the luck of traveling there, and they give you really a deep sense of some almost forgotten Middle Ages, also as this specific corner of Europe. Catherine's successive marriages had placed her at the center of a web of Italian, French, and Low Country connections that complicated the final negotiations, yet the recovery of the barony closed a long-standing gap in the northern frontier, restored direct comital control over the rich wine-growing districts and the tolls of the lake ports. It was quite important lake-portual connection in northwestern Alps. The barony of Vaud, stretching from the northern shore of Lake Geneva, in fact, into the Jura foothills, had been held by the scattered branch since the 13th century partition. We remember before the wine of the Lavaux slopes, already prized in the 14th century, provided a steady source of export revenue once the barony returned to direct control, enhancing the fiscal base of the reunified northern territories. Financial strain, already severe after the Faucigny campaign and the French expedition, forced the temporary sale of judicial and castellany offices under right of repurchase, converting offices once held by trusted nobles into sources of profit. The practice of selling offices under repurchase rights, already common in France, was adopted to Savoyard conditions with careful safeguards to prevent permanent alienation, reflecting the Count's determination to maintain ultimate control, even while raising immediate funds. Against his cousin James of Savoy, Achaia, yet other branch, in this case connected with the important Latin house of Romania, this was the Lord of Pinerolo in Turin, who continued the independence policy of his father Philip and sought imperial privileges to mint coin, create notaries, and levy tolls. Amadeus proceeded with measured severity. James's claim to the empty title of Prince of Achaia derived from an earlier marriage alliance with the Latin rulers of the Morea, a residual claim that gave him a pretext for asserting quasi-sovereign rights within the Piedmontese fiefs. After recalling James to his feudal obligations, he declared him forfeit on November 4th, 1356, and seized the Piedmontese fiefs. James submitted to arbitration, then in 1359 restored the contested tolls and persecuted the Count's partisans. Amadeus again proclaimed him rebel, occupied the territories, and obtained an arbitral sentence of total spoliation. This time, a final attempt at resistance led to James's capture and imprisonment. In 1361, Amadeus released him, however, and restored the fief under stringent conditions of vassalage, though. He also arranged James's marriage to Margaret of Beaujeu, a woman loyal to the comital house. Margaret, drawn from a family long allied to the French crown, provided a reliable counterweight to James' residual independence and ensured that the next generation of the Achaia line would remain dependent on the main Savoyard house. When Margaret pressed for the disinheritance of James's son by a previous marriage, Philip, in favor of her own children, Amadeus intervened as judge, approved the disinheritance, organized the process against Philip on charges of rebellion, and secured his condemnation and drowning in the lake of Avigliana in 1368. Interestingly enough, this was a glacial basin at the entrance to the Susa Valley, so the gate to Italy, offering a remote and unobserved setting for the elimination of a claimant whose continued existence threatened the fragile settlement in Piedmont. The glacial origin of the lake ensured deep cold waters that left little physical evidence of the act as well. The younger sons of the second marriage, Amadeus and Louis, thereafter remained securely dependent on the Count, to whom they owed their fortunes. Right? Consider that there is all some aura. We've seen it also before with the altar of sacred ruling here. So there were legions. We've seen it also during the Pataria in northern Italy of these bodies of knights that had been martyrized and thrown in the lakes and remained. So the deepest of the abyss in an archetypal sense had remerged intact, whatever. So here, again, pretty cold, brutal, dark backgrounds in many ways. Parallel pressure was applied to the Marquises of Saluzzo. This was yet another Piedmontese principality. Ancient feudal bonds linked the Alderamics to Savoy. Yet Frederick II had also performed homage to the Dauphin in 1343 and 1354. Frederick II of Saluzzo repeatedly exploited such overlapping claims of Empire, France, and Savoy to preserve a precarious independence, virtual at least independence, a strategy that made the Marquisate a persistent obstacle to Savoyard consolidation east of the Alps. You didn't simply take over these places. There were the Milanese in between. You couldn't simply carry out this vast policy of conquest. It's all there is a sound mountain background, yes, but also resources were strained, and you had to be careful about not unbalancing yourself too much, not alienating the subjects' sympathies excessively with all these wars and impositions. In 1363, taking advantage of French weakness, Amadeus besieged, however, Saluzzo, because there was all a French projection of power in as far as Genoa is concerned. So it's a very interesting side of the story. We'll see it especially as far as another biography of a near contemporary here that I'm not going to mention. I can only say he's French, but extracted recognition of vassalage and released the Marquis for only for the latter to cross the Alps and renew homage to the Dauphin at Embrun. Subsequent imperial decrees transferring the marquisate to Savoy for the crime of lèse-majesty proved unenforceable against French protection exercised through the Parlement of Paris and the garrison placed at Carmagnola as well. Carmagnola was a fortified town on the Po Plain, served as a French outpost designed specifically to support Saluzzo against Savoyard pressure, illustrating the limits of imperial grants in the face of Valois military presence. This was also in a pretty difficult time for France overall, so it shows you again how dependent in a way or another Savoy is on French power, how feeble at this point, even more imperial power was in these areas. There are so many different issues here, but fundamentally it's a Piedmontese theater. Right, so it's something relatively detached from the heat of Lombardy, where the greater forces moved and so on. In any case, in fact, Saluzzo controlled the Upper Po Valley and the Col de l'Arche was the most direct route between Provence and the Piedmontese plain. So this is toward the southwest, basically, closer to the sea, but also to some of the harshest mountains there. And there are all these valleys sort of entering. There are various seigneuries of sort that tend to be ever more fleeting as the higher the altitude, so to say, the scarcer the resources. Nevertheless, they are very important, and they are somehow difficult to tame. Saluzzo's ability to play French and imperial patterns against each other made it a persistent obstacle to Savoyard consolidation east of the Alps. The Col de l'Arche, though higher, more difficult than the Mont Cenis, offered a shorter route for military forces moving between the Provençal coast and the Po Valley, giving Saluzzo strategic value that far exceeded its modest territorial extent. Because remember, the Provence is in the hands of the Angevins, right? So there is a seneschal there that responds to Naples. It's admittedly actually a very detached thing, right? There was a seneschal for Piedmont, but this had evaporated. Also the death of King Robert the Wise, but there is a fil rouge that unites all these French territories in a broader international sense. So that's why also in the aftermath of the Battle of Poitiers, you have France having this important leverage, especially in these very specific provinces of northwestern Italy. In the Valais, Amadeus continued to act as defender of the Bishop of Sion against the German-speaking communities of the Upper Valley, supported by Basel and Milan simultaneously. Milan has all its sort of Alpine interests, will confront itself as well against the Swiss, so Basel is also connected with all these various alliances. After the capture of Sion, Amadeus became the bishop's bailiff himself. So in other words, the lay enforcer, protector, the advocate of such spiritual authority. Yet, at this point, imperial position and local resistance prevented lasting annexation of Sion, per se. The city of Basel, we just mentioned, itself under Habsburgic pressure. So, in Savoyard intervention, a useful counterweight to both local peasant leagues and imperial officials, providing the count with an occasional ally beyond the immediate Alpine region. So you see, everybody has a reason, right? You have to really dig into all these various policies and understand why they were aligned with this or that one at a given time. Things change pretty fast, pretty quickly. Especially as they are more dependent powers. I mean, Savoy in later history is unanimously known also in its Italian continuation, like for sort of change inside, even though this was happening pretty much everywhere. This is instinct of survival, in particular between powers like France, like the Habsburgs. That's why also we made that video about 18th century warfare. Throughout these years, Amadeus strengthened his ties with the empire anyway, and as a counterweight really to French encirclement. So locally, yes, there could be these issues that eventually reached the Habsburgs or the Luxembourgs, and that were not really necessarily delighted to hear of this stuff. But say there were all kind of things going on, especially at this time. When Charles IV of Luxembourg entered Italy in 1355, Savoyard ambassadors obtained confirmation of all privileges granted by previous emperors. Right? Remember the connection of the Luxembourgs with Henry VII. Charles IV's Italian journey, I made an entire video about Charles's reign, undertaken to secure his imperial coronation in particular, provided a rare, it would be multiple of these expeditions though, provided a rare opportunity, relatively rare, for Alpine princes to obtain direct imperial confirmation of their rights. In particular, this one, because again, it had to basically secure probably the imperial crown. The Savoyard mission secured, in turn, formal recognition of the Count's existing privileges at a moment of heightened imperial presence in the peninsula. Further, missions to Prague in 1356 urged the emperor to reinforce comital authority against the French kings who had seized Lyon. That was technically, even though it was on the other side of the Rhone compared to the empire, was actually an imperial dependency. And it's not until the 15th century that the French would fully annexate Lyon. There was always this juridical awkwardness about this kind of things. The same had occurred with Vivier and the Dauphiné in equal ways. Charles then granted the right of appeal from every court within the Savoyard state to the imperial tribunal, enabling the count to exercise effective control over ecclesiastical institutions. The right of appeal to the imperial court proved particularly valuable in disputes with neighboring bishoprics whose temporal claims conflicted with comital jurisdiction, allowing the Savoyards to bypass local ecclesiastical courts when necessary. In 1361, the emperor declared the Count of Savoy and its dependencies incorporated into the empire for good, because technically they had always been, but this is a reinforcement, but with this specific, in fact, distinction, which was juridically novel, being detached from the kingdom of Arles. This is very relevant. Remember what we said before about the fragmentation of powers in the form of greater regionalization, localization of power. This is exactly what is happening. Savoy was part of the kingdom of Burgundy, right? So it should have remained within this realm that, however, had become a ghost, basically, for all a series of reasons that I explained in the video about the kingdoms of Burgundy. They were different at some point, realities of that kind. So at this point, Savoy is just like a province on its own in the empire, detached from, in fact, this dying kingdom. And this means that they're basically sovereign. There is a level of immediacy with the Holy Roman Emperors and between the Holy Roman Emperors and Savoy, which makes them naturally more privileged. In fact, as you know, they will eventually step up to ducal authority and so on in later Middle Ages. In May 1365, at Le Bourget, after a magnificent reception at Chambéry, during which Amadeus and his barons served the emperor on horseback while a fountain of wine played continuously, Charles created Amadeus Perpetual, an hereditary imperial vicar in the dioceses of Sion, Lausanne, Geneva, Aut, Ivrea, Turin, Maurienne, Tarentaise, Belley, and the county of Savoy, together with dependent lands in the dioceses of Lyon, Mahon, and Grenoble. The ceremonial service of the emperor by the count and his barons on horseback deliberately evoked the ancient rituals of imperial vassalage while simultaneously advertising Savoyard wealth, and the vicariate purchased for 100,000 écus, conferring appellate jurisdiction over a wide Alpine arc and transforming the count from a purely feudal lord into a quasi-sovereign prince, whose authority derived from imperial commission as well as from hereditary right. Right? This is a huge deal. As we explained, it was bought, as other titles will be bought later on, by this essentially becoming Italian power, in the case of Savoy, but this happened also for Milan and so on. The Gonzaga, we made different videos. Also because these places had the money, right? And if you think about this from the perspective of Bohemia, Charles IV was ruling over probably the heart of 14th century Europe. Bohemia was had become not necessarily the unexpected, but say the still unlikely center of medieval Europe at that very point. And it definitely had a great power, but as we've seen also in Germany, it tended to sort of dilute itself relatively quickly the further from Prague you were. But in this sense, having a major imperial fief that could sort of wedge between the Italian kingdom, the French one, etc., was something that basically would not threaten any other imperial house. That, as you know, we're pretty much all in the east now. I mean, not even in Germany in this case. And so allowing for the development of one of Europe's at least secondary powers in later history among the bigger ones. The diploma legitimized Savoyard ambitions in the Genoa, Valais, Geneva, and Lausanne, although Geneva itself soon eluded full control, its communal institutions and commercial wealth allowing, in fact, the city to resist full incorporation despite the formal grant. The same chivalric culture that produced the imperial vicariate found expression in the foundation of the Order of the Collar in 1362 or 1364. 14 or 15 knights were bound by a common religious and moral ideal, here under a collar of gilded silver from which hung 3 knots of love intertwined with roses in honor of the Virgin. The enigmatic motto First appeared in the spaces formed by the knots. And the motto First was precise meaning, in fact, remains debated among historians, was already associated with the Savoyard house and would later be incorporated into the arms of the dynasty, while the number of knights here was deliberately set at 15 to honor the 15 joys of the Virgin, and the intertwined knots and roses evoked both the feudal bond of mutual fidelity and the Marian devotion that underpinned late medieval chivalric ideology. Right. The order was intended to recall the feudal knights of Savoy to the religious and moral commitments and to attach them by an explicit pledge of fidelity to the prince. If you're interested in the various hypotheses of what First may mean, this different hypotheses were offered. Like first, federe et religione tenemus, that is to say, treaty and religion bind us. Fortitudo eius rodum tenuit, that is, his strength conquered roads, or by his bravery he held or occupied roads, referring to the victory of Amadeus V, we'll talk about him, Count of Savoy, who fought in the 1315 siege of Rhodes. So very interesting history there. Then you have Fortitudo eius rem publicam tenet, so his bravery or strength preserves or defends the state, referencing the same ruler Amadeus V, or Fides est regni tutela. This fate is the protector of our kingdom, right? Then we will sort of talk. There are other, parodies of it, such as, for example, in French, frapper and très rompetu, which was a mockery, essentially issued by the French. It says strike, enter, break everything, referring actually to the effective Savoyard penchant for chevaucheurs that they were seen a bit as the sort of the wild mountaineers, like coming with raiding in the lowlands, which was not far from those war bands. Instead, the green livery that earned him his enduring sobriquet had first appeared at a tournament held at the Vernay of Chambéry on May the 1st, 1348. Chambéry would actually be the real center of Savoy, actually becoming that, when the 14-year-old count at the time and his companions, a pretty grim year to celebrate it with a tournament, but still, his companions wore green armor, plumes, and trappings. The color was thereafter retained as a personal and court preference associated in contemporary eyes with the traditional attire of errant knighthood in particular. We'll talk more about heraldic symbolism, like the deeper archetypal meaning even of colors and so on. The Vernay, by the way, was an open meadow outside the walls of Chambéry. It had long served as a traditional site for tournaments and public assemblies, and the choice of green, a color linked in contemporary heraldic symbolism both to youth and, as we've seen here, the wandering knight in the open, in the forest, deliberately projected an image of vigorous, mobile lordship at a moment when the young count was still under regency, by the way. And so the sobriquet Green Count provides us with eventually the most fundamental marker of Amadeus VI trail of the Counts of Savoy, contemporary chroniclers noted that the green livery was worn not only by the Count's personal household, but also by the larger companies of men-at-arms that accompanied him on campaign, making the color a recognizable emblem of Savoyard military identity across the Alps and into Italy, which is also quite modern for the time, because very few noblemen can afford these kind of uniformed liveries. It's something mostly starts happening in the 15th century. I also made a video about that for the English liverymen of especially the times of the Wars of the Roses. There is a reason for that. Say, these level of uniformity had somehow always existed in the core retinues, etc. But here it's also a way to show further wealth, for the capacity to homogenize, to uniform, to supply, right? In January 1364, Amadeus joined the alliance formed by Urban V against the aforementioned free companies that ravaged Provence in this moment. Urban V, remember, the popes are still in Avignon. This was a former Benedictine abbot of austere personal habits, was sought to restore order in the papal territories of southern France by combining spiritual sanctions with military force. And so the Savoyard commitment to his cause reflected both the Count's desire to protect the western approaches to Italy and his growing involvement in papal politics. The following year, Amadeus escorted Charles IV to Arles for the imperial coronation as king of the kingdom of Arles. Remember, this kingdom was not capable of controlling Savoy anymore just by saying the same Luxembourg's will, but still the ability to, but very few so-called Germanic emperors, so to say, were able to project their power after Burgundy to launch an expedition there. Famously, Barbarossa had done, but we're talking centuries earlier. So this was a very important power, especially here, Charles IV's power projection. The Savoyards were the power of honor in this region. The coronation at Arles, though largely symbolic by this time, still carried important legal implications for the status of the former Burgundian kingdom and for the imperial claims that underpinned Savoyard authority in the Western Alps, especially against French encroachment. The crusading expedition of 1366-1367 is the high point, right, of Amadeus's reign. It arose from both kingship and religious impulse. We'll never fully appreciate how true and deep faith was at this point, especially in the hearts of leaders, and also how much practical gain could be derived from that. John V Palaeologus, son of Anna of Savoy, and therefore first cousin to Amadeus, the Palaeologians were trying to marry with this point secondary houses of Europe, but still for reasons like this, namely, in fact, the possibility of calling some crusade reinforcement against the Turks from the west, faced, in fact, Ottoman pressure under Murad I, and had been detained by the Bulgarian Tsar Ivan Alexander while returning from negotiations in Hungary, where he had gone to seek further support. Usually going out to seek Hungarian help, especially for a Byzantine, is not a good indicator of a prosperity, of stability. Anna of Savoy, daughter of Amadeus V, had ruled as regent in Constantinople herself during the minority of her son and had maintained close correspondence with her Western relatives, creating thus a personal bond that made the Alpine Count a natural ally for the beleaguered Byzantine emperor. John V Palaeologus, emperor of a shrinking Byzantine state, looked to his Western kinsman for military support at a moment when Ottoman expansion threatened the remaining European territories of the empire. I made some months ago a video about the Byzantine civil wars of the 1350s, how they had basically called the Turks into the Balkans themselves as they were clashing against one another. Now the situation was really becoming critical. Murad I had already established a permanent Ottoman presence in Thrace. In fact, it was systematically reducing the remaining Byzantine enclaves, rendering the recovery of key fortresses a matter of survival for the Palaeologan regime. So this was reason of concern for everybody in Europe, right? We made lots of videos about the Ottomans in Schwerpunkt's earlier days, we will come back naturally on this, especially in the last year. We talked more about Ottoman warfare in the Renaissance, right? But there is all this step-by-step phase where you realize that even though there was not much of a generalized effort to push the Ottomans out of Europe, which up to very late in time would have been actually fairly easy to do, or at least had been a general commitment, it would have probably been done. Actually, the reason why the Ottomans were left alive, for example, after the Tatar invasion, and essentially the Hospitallers in Venice decided that it was not even in their interest in the moment to unplug the lifeline of this power, allowed for this Ottoman conquest to accumulate. But at the same time, the Western effort was present. Like the care, the understanding, the observation was there. Probably at the time, because it was probably really clear that the Ottomans did not constitute in the immediate moment like this enormous threat. But for rulers like the Green Count, like opportunities could arise also through these ventures. At Avignon, Amadeus took the cross in the presence of Urban V, as did John II of France. Not together, actually. John had already died, like he never got to fulfill this crusading vow. When one of his royal hostages, his son, Louis, Duke of Anjou, broke parole and escaped from English custody, John chose to uphold chivalric honor and voluntarily returned to captivity in England in late 1363, where he died a few months later, by the way, in April 1364, at the Palace of Savoy, which was actually one of the vestiges of this Savoyard power in England. Again, quite internationally sought after, the Savoyards, for different reasons. And so Amadeus leaves for these, leaving the government of Savoy in the capable hands, as we've seen before, of Bourbon. Amadeus assembled a force of approximately 2,000 men in a fleet of 15 to 17 vessels, 2 of them supplied by Venice, the others hired from Genoese and Marseillais owners. The Venetian contribution reflected both commercial interest in the security of the eastern trade routes, so the more crusaders, the better. Like the problem was always manpower. Like ships did cost, but I mean the Venetians were definitely the power that the world had more of them to simply give to assist in these operations. And also long, perhaps more importantly, long-standing rivalry with Genoa that could thus not simply sponsor the crusade to the same level. While the mixed composition of the fleet illustrated the practical difficulties of mounting a crusading expedition in an age not just of competing Italian maritime powers. I made entire videos if you're interested in the bitterest, in fact, period of Venetian-Genoese rivalry. That is exactly this one. But also because of the general crisis of the era, the fact that definitely the plague, the economic crisis had rendered the Mediterranean more insecure, right? The Muslim powers basically are coming back. The Italians are still hegemonic. Like you really have to wait for the fall of Constantinople for the Turks to come back to begin with a meaningful naval power. But it was full of pirates, and there had been, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, lots of other expeditions. The Crusade of Smyrna was the most important. We shall make videos about Malherbe, the German, for example, that went over to die there as a vow, contracted up there. He had been defeated in a battle. So the same crusading effort is fragmented a bit like through these three companies. But Amadeus leaves. The fleet sailed from Venice on June the 21st, 1366, touched at Pola, Ragusa, Modon, Coron, and Negroponte, and on reaching the Dardanelles, clamorously enough, stormed Gallipoli. Held by the Turks since 1354, during the Byzantine Civil War, talking about before. So this free gateway, it's as if they had united Europe and Asia through that bridge fortress. After, in fact, an earthquake had damaged its walls. Right, it's like the trope of Attila that stormed Aquileia, just because at some point the Roman walls were ruined, fell by themselves. This was a clamorous expedition a blitz rally from the sea, by the way, in a relatively unconventional way, that restored Gallipoli to Byzantine control as well. We've seen here this various Adriatic cities that the expedition had sailed through Paula and Ragusa, both under Venetian influence at the time, provided secure harbors and supplies for outward voyage. The recovery of Gallipoli, however temporary, briefly restored Byzantine control of the straits and reopened the possibility of coordinated Christian resistance. The action, as we were saying, is really important. Unlike bloated, unmanageable medieval crusades, Amadeus relied on a tight, highly professionalized mobile force. He utilized the fleet of around 15 to 16 ships, primarily, as we've seen, Venetian and Genoese hired galleys. They were also, however, the best you could find at the time, carrying roughly 1,500 to 1,700 men, a mix of elite Savoyard knights, professional crossbowmen, archers, and naval infantry. The aforementioned chivalric orders had been established also for a reason, to motivate them participating in this enormous enterprises, to especially in a spiritual sense for the participants. Like, this was seeking that, again, higher plane, right? Arriving at the Dardanelles on August the 22nd, Amadeus bypassed a prolonged traditional siege. Instead, he launched an immediate, coordinated amphibious assault directly onto the beaches of the Gallipoli Peninsula. Heavily armored Western knights and mercenary foot soldiers forced their way ashore under missile cover from shipborne archers. They drove straight toward the landward and seaward fortifications. The speed, aggression, and sheer shock value of the Western assault heavily unnerved the Ottoman garrison. Facing the fierce breach attempts and demoralized by the suddenness of the naval landing, the Turkish defenders abandoned the outer positions and fled or evacuated under the cover of night. Local Greek inhabitants quickly capitalized on the chaos to open the gates from within, allowing the Crusaders to pour in and secure the stronghold. Recognizing the critical strategic value of Gallipoli as the choke point between Europe and Asia, Amadeus did not linger. He immediately reorganized the fortifications, established robust Christian garrisons, and cleared the surrounding peninsula of residual Ottoman forces before pivoting his fleet toward the Black Sea. Right? This is, as you know very well, what happened also in 1950. It's literally the same places. Finding the emperor, by the way, still captive, we've seen before what the situation was. Amadeus altered his plan, sailed into the Black Sea in early October, successfully captured Sozopoulis, Anchialos, Mesembri, and Varna. Remember, the Emperor John V was in the hands of the Bulgarians that were, because of this other lightning campaign, to release John V by threat of further operations. So this is very interesting because, as you see here, a handful, like what's an army of a few thousand men, right? They were pretty good, as we've seen, but they managed to storm a majorly strategic Turkish stronghold with a masterful amphibious operations. They attack equally the Bulgarian seaboard. They forced literally an entire, admittedly the so-called Second Bulgarian Empire was not exactly in great shape at this point in history, but still, right? These men are indefatigable, resolute. By the way, the Black Sea ports of Sozopoulis and Mesembri that they recovered had long been centers of Byzantine commercial activity and retained substantial Greek populations. It was really normal since ever on the coast, right, wherever the Greeks had historically colonized, making their capture both a military and a symbolic assertion of overall Christian recovery in the region, because even the Bulgars that were Christian were somehow a counter-cultural force, at least toward the Byzantine Empire historically. So it was a matter of world order restoration of some sort. Here, with the chrism of the Byzantine blood, also Amadeus, who wintered with the emperor himself, the saved emperor, at Mesembri, arriving before Christmas, and conducting difficult negotiations on behalf of the Pope concerning the union of the churches, which was a vexata questions. You know, at this point, the Byzantines were trying everything to reunite the East and West, to seek protection from from the latter, but if anything, Byzantine society did not want this. They ended up opening the gates to the Turks rather than being subject to the Latins, which definitely did not really help the overall future of these regions in history. Now, John V promised to send ambassadors to Rome. In the meanwhile, and also, of course, the same Amadeus was trying to push there for imagine the prestige, right, of in the aftermath of this, reuniting this in the West. Only then did Amadeus return, reaching Venice on July the 29th, 1367. He proceeded to Viterbo to report to Urban V, escorted the Pope on his solemn return to Rome, and presented the Byzantine envoys himself. Urban V's return to Rome, by the way, was the first by a pope in nearly 70 years. Right? Last spring I made a video about the Avignon Papacy. If you're interested, I also discussed all the various pontiffs here, who they were, what they did, mostly in ecclesiastical policy. Pretty turbulent times in general. And this return was obviously intended to restore the prestige of the papacy after the long Avignon residence. And in the presence of the Savoyard Count and the Byzantine envoys underscored the international character of the occasion as well. Right, a great, again, Western reunion. Upon his reappearance in the West, Amadeus found the Italian balance of power altered by, unsurprisingly, the aggressive expansion of the Visconti. Again, were by far the most powerful territorial state in the broader region, and did obviously threaten, like the Savoyard frontier. Although family ties and earlier alliances persisted, in fact, the danger of Milanese hegemony, that at this point had been projecting far and wide, almost trying to extend over the entirety of the Italic kingdom, reinforced by Visconti marriages into the French royal house as well, could no longer be ignored. In 1368, Amadeus refused a Visconti proposal for the partition of northern Italy and instead supported the young Marquises of Montferrat. Right? It was somehow easier at the end of the day to make leverage on all these various potentates that definitely feared the Milanese and therefore were sort of more motivated in the end, right? Whereas, of course, partition of Italy meant what? That in the moment, yes, you get something, but if Milan is the strongest power and strengthens itself at the detriment of these other players, like not even Savoy can do much to maintain its Pau-Valley possessions in Piedmont. Now, the young Marquises of Montferrat, still minors at the time, required external protection against both Visconti pressure and internal factionalism. So this was a great chance for Amadeus to step in. Savoyard intervention so preserved a residual independent power on the edge of the Milanese sphere. When Urban V and Charles IV organized a coalition against Galeazzo and Bernabò Visconti, Amadeus accepted the captaincy of the League's army. We are in 1372. Amadeus is also loaded with a certain military expertise, as we've seen from his wars in the Alps and his brilliant expedition in the east, relieved Asti in Piedmont. I made an entire video about medieval Asti. This was the most important city at the time. Turin was already the Savoyard stronghold that eventually becomes also one of the most important cities in the region. And it's still the main, the head city in Piedmont today, as became the capital of Savoy, right? And even of Italy at the beginning, the very beginning. Really, Amadeus relieves Asti from Visconti assault, right? Occupied Cuneo with papal troops in October. Cuneo stands for properly the position of the city in this valley. It's just like a Cuneus. In fact, it dated back as a settlement from Roman times, exactly because of its strategic relevance. In the spring of 1373, Amadeus invades the Milanese state itself, crossing from Novara to Brescia, so literally from west to east, right, skirting around Milan. This gives you an idea of how powerful also his force was, backed by the Pope against, again, this formidable opponent of the Milanese. Asti, we just said, it was a prosperous commercial city with tendentially strong wealth traditions. not entirely dependent on the establishment, but it had repeatedly sought Savoyard protection against Milanese expansion. And its relief demonstrated the continuing value of Savoyard military intervention in the Piedmontese plain. Besides here, there are all other important ties, in fact, prevented from joining the papal forces under John Hawkwood, who had, as you know, also was the greatest free company's commander, right? The White Company of Englishmen, largely Englishmen, veterans from the 100 Years' War, now sort of released after the Treaty of Bretigny, is such an immense figure in the era, right? And who had been halted at Montechiari, however. Amadeus executed a skillful march southward through Emilia to Bologna and thence into Tuscany, reinforcing the anti-Visconti party at Pisa as well. John Hawkwood in this is relevant because, of course, as an English condottiere, he had commanded this most professional mercenary force then operating in Italy, representing a significant military asset for the same Papal League, yet the failure to coordinate the two armies limited the overall impact of the campaign, which also speaks of the general difficulties of the year. And again, it's pretty messy. Only at this point, Italy is starting to recover from the Free Companies period, so to say, and essentially Black Death crisis. Actually, the country was never as deeply prey of these companies that were, at the end of the day, proxies of the same Italian powers, right? Differently from France, that at some point was left properly at the mercy of these war bands, including the same French ones, much deeper, more broadly systemic crisis, right? But it had been a very difficult time, right? Really lots of wars, a period of generalized crisis. We've seen it also in the series about the Italian communes of the various cities, where the bigger regional states essentially start completely swallowing up the smaller cities. In February 1374, Amadeus returned by sea via Savona in Liguria. Mediation between the Visconti and the papacy followed in the process, meaning that, of course, there had been a proper military result obtained by this campaign. Between 1375 and 1378, Amadeus successfully occupied territories in the Vercelli area. This, like we mentioned Novara before, these are places that eventually, because of the Savoy, will be incorporated in what is called Piedmont, still to this day, but at the time they were actually Lombardy, right? Lombardy was much bigger, like historical Lombardy occupied through a much broader expanse of territory. And as you can understand how it is a loose idea. If anything, modern Lombardy also follows the pattern, part of the core of what had become Milanese power, right? Also, in the same area, Amadeus is accepted as Lord of Biella. We are in 1379. Biella was a textile center in the foothills of the Alps, provided both economic value and strategic foothold on the edge of the Milanese sphere, consolidating Savoyard gains in the region. The Visconti, having indeed learned to respect Savoyard arms that after all had contributed also to Milanese military force in other times in history as allies, abandoned attempts to recover the lost lands after this war, though they later reasserted influence over Montferrat and recovered Asti as well. A sharp encounter at Gavardo on the river Chiesa resulted in the total defeat of Visconti forces and prompted the Count of Virtù, son of Galeazzo, to seek alliance rather than continued hostility. The river Chiesa flows south from the Alps into the Po Plain, marking a natural boundary between the Brescian and Mantuan spheres of influence. This tells you how sort of wide the theater of this war had been, right? Literally the entirety, as we've seen, almost of northern and central Italy. There are so many different soldiers of fortune operating here. I made a video also on Braccio, for example, if you look at especially later times. But say this is the properly starting from the late 70s and properly the 80s. That is the moment in which the free companies cease, the mercenary phase, the foreign phase ends, and the condottas start being recruited only from Italy from being constituted by Italians almost completely, right? So there's a moment of great territorial resettlement and re-expansion, especially of the emerging regional states. There is also another Milanese defeat at Gavardo, demonstrating once again the effectiveness of Savoyard tactics against larger Milanese forces that were also, however, pretty darn good. Gian Galeazzo, already consolidating power in the shadow, his uncle Bernabo, recognized that prolonged warfare with Savoy risked diverting resources from his larger designs against Verona, Padua, and the remaining independent Lombard cities. In fact, there was all a general pressure there placed, especially in northeastern Italy. The Milanese tried to infiltrate there because those Treviso and Mark communes, powers, signories' powers had been historically collapsing. That's also, you have a lot of interesting clashes. Think about Castagnaro. Speaking of John Hawkwood, we should make a video about John Hawkwood because it's unbelievable. Never really even discussed him. We talked about the White Company, I think not even in the video about the free companies, because we wanted to really treat it as something on its own, and we're definitely at least making a video also as far as its army, its force organization was concerned in a video on its own, right? Whatever's not appeared yet on Schwerpunkt, we're going to cover anyway at some other point. The Count of Virtù, by the way, later known as Gian Galeazzo Visconti, and I made an entire biography video about him, recognized that continued open warfare with Savoy risked diverting resources, in fact, from these other ambitious designs against the remaining independent Lombard cities, and his subsequent rise to the title of Duke of Milan would rest in part on the careful avoidance of prolonged war with the Alpine power to his west. The duchy was bought, also in this case, from the emperor, right, with the enormous amount of Milanese wealth. And so you see the similarity, as we were saying before, in northern Italy. All these regional states emerged from free communes that managed to consolidate around a mother city, and they become actual states of the empire, right? Financial necessity continued to press, however. The Savoyards were not as rich as the Milanese. In 1373, Amadeus, in fact, borrowed 8,000 ducats from the Forlì bankers Bonaventura Consiglio and partners, pledging his crown and other valuables as security. It's not really a good indicator of wealth. The Forlì bankers, operating within the papal financial network that had already supported, in spite of the precarious state of the papal states, especially after the Avignon parenthesis, specialized in short-term loans secured on precious objects rather than on territorial revenues. A practice that allowed princes to raise immediate funds without alienating permanent resources, but also eventually being less systemic, being actually less money. This is really typical because, say, Romagna was not particularly famous for banking in general, so this was mostly this second-hand papal financial circuit in a moment in which the papacy also was not faring that well. We shall actually make more videos about the papal states during this period because it's really a fascinating time with Albornoz and etc. Now, overall, administrative measures accompanied the military and diplomatic activity. For example, in 1351, Amadeus had convened solemn assizes of the three estates of Savoy, Aosta, and Piedmont at Aosta/Aote, from 16th to the 20th of August, holding open-air sessions for civil causes, criminal arrears, and feudal appeals, thereby reinforcing the prince's moral authority at the expense of over-mighty officials, right? The open-air setting of the Aote assizes, by the way, deliberately evoked the ancient assemblies of freemen, still retained symbolic force in the Alpine valleys. It was really very important. Linking the count's justice to older traditions of communal participation. From 1355, Amadeus had reorganized an ambulatory council of justice attached to his person, independent of the sedentary council at Chambéry, because these places were not particularly particular centers per se. The court itself was itinerant. The Alps were less centers, obviously. And it was this Council of Justice was composed of 28 bishops, barons, and legists, so it was also a pretty sizable one. You can imagine all these people traveling with Amadeus. 2 or 3 members sufficed to constitute the court, however, wherever the count happened to reside. The ambulatory council thus allowed the count to dispense justice in person during his frequent travels, reinforcing the personal bond between ruler and subjects and ensuring that justice remained a visible attribute of princely authority. Especially that, sort of in the absence of the emperor, he was, as we've seen, sovereign on all his domains, really. He also introduced the French practices of the counter seal and the counter signature to guarantee the authenticity of documents in an age fertile in forgeries. The counter seal applied by a second official provided an additional safeguard against the production of false charters that had become increasingly common during the disorders of the mid-century, reflecting the count's concern for documentary integrity in an era of administrative expansion, among other things. In Tarentaise, the long contest with the archbishop over jurisdiction was settled by a partition of June the 27th, 1358. A criminal justice over the archbishop's vassals remained with the prelate, while the count retained it over natives of any land under his obedience. Notarial registers were divided, irregular clerical successions and usurers' estates subjected to special rules, and corporal sentences against the count's subjects forbidden within episcopal fiefs. The division of notarial registers ensured that both parties retained documentary evidence of their respective rights, and the archbishop paid 3,000 florins of fine Florentine gold for the agreement, which marked a further stage in the progressive assertion of comital authority over the province. Tarentaise, whose archbishops had long claimed extensive temporal rights in the Upper Isère Valley, represented one of the last major enclaves whose jurisdictional autonomy required systematic reduction if the count were to achieve uniform authority throughout his Alpine domains. Right? Ecclesiastical principalities scattered all over the empire were historically endowed with pretty substantial privileges, immunities. This had made them veritable landlords themselves, who were simply a bit difficult to command, right? Because we could simply say no, right? And this would have created problems. In fact, the Archbishop of Tarentaise had, for this reason, historically enjoyed a degree of independence comparable to that of the very bishops of Sion, and the 1358 partition represented as a significant curtailment of that independence in favor of comital jurisdiction. Other major issue, the outbreak of the Great Schism in 1378, that found Amadeus firmly in the obedience of his kinsman Robert of Geneva, elected as Clement VII himself at Avignon. Right, so it stuck with the Avignonese party. Robert had been elected by the French cardinals after the contested election of Urban VI. He brought the Genevan house into the center of European ecclesiastical politics and provided thus the Savoyard count with a personal stake in the Avignon cause. Amadeus first contemplated a military expedition to Rome on behalf of the Avignon Pope to enforce his own rights. Later, when Louis I of Anjou, adopted by the childless Joanna I of Naples, prepared an expedition to recover the kingdom from Charles of Durazzo, you have all those issues between the Angevin branches of Naples, of Hungary. Very difficult story. That's a good idea for especially a campaign video, war video, say to say. Amadeus adhered with enthusiasm because he said, we can't join this broader force, right? And we have a way to settle the matter along the way in central southern Italy. As you know, Joanna I of Naples was the last Angevin ruler of the southern kingdom, had adopted Louis of Anjou in a desperate attempt to secure a powerful protector against the Durazzo claim, and the Savoyard commitment reflected both dynastic solidarity and the prospect of territorial gains in Piedmont. Sort of very complicated history, but we don't have much time to look at the Neapolitan perspective here. In return for future assistance against the Visconti, Amadeus received immediate possession of Cuneo, the last Angevin foothold in Piedmont, because as we said before, there had been a seneschal of Piedmont that was this sort of Neapolitan proxy, also supported from Provence, that was in Angevin hands, and was proclaimed Lord of Asti by the Guelph party on March the 23rd, 1382. So other very prestigious title, even though at a local level, but still as a figure of distinction. 4 days later, ambassadors from Cuneo as well offered the submission of their city. In July 1382, Amadeus crossed the peninsula with more than 1,000 lances and joined the Angevin army. It's a pretty substantial force, representing one, in fact, of the largest Savoyard military expeditions ever mounted outside the Alpine region. Demonstrating the organizational capacity the Green Count had developed over decades of campaigning. Right, these men, really, we should make, if anything, specific videos about the very depths of the individual campaigns, the military exploit of these men. Again, you understand this video is pretty long the way it is to tell the story, but there is probably a military history as well. Perhaps we should have made a military biography, but there's always time to do the same, in fact. Early successes in Abruzzo and Apulia followed, because in any case, they were going at war with in the south. Yet scarcity of supplies and the outbreak of epidemic disease in January 1383 rapidly reduced the camps. After many of his knights had perished, Amadeus himself succumbed to the plague at Santo Stefano near Castropignano on March the 1st, 1383, having on February 27th dictated his last will, in which he named his son Amadeus Universal Heir, under the tutelage of Bourbon, and requested burial at Hautecombe. Castropignano was a small fortress in the Molise county, laying far from the main theaters of Angevin operations, and offered little protection against the spread of disease, leaving the Savoyard contingent isolated in a hostile and pestilential environment. This is the Black Death rebooting cyclically every once in a while until the early 18th century in Europe, since 1347-48. Amadeus, on his deathbed, entrusted the ring of Saint Maurice, that was the symbol of comital authority, to the Marshal Gaspard of Montmayor for delivery to the heir. Remember that Savoy was a French house, like by cultural language, so there's always this dimension, even though they were essentially an Italian power by this point, territorially, but they held not just lots of French-speaking territory, but they were themselves like French. It will remain until, say, more recent history. The Marshal himself, however, died a month and a half later, right? Again, pretty dark time overall. The ring, associated with the Theban legionary Maurice, whose cult had been promoted by the early counts of Savoy, served as this tangible emblem of legitimate succession, whose physical transfer confirmed the continuity of comital power across the generations. And the cult of Saint Maurice, centered on the Abbey of Saint Maurice d'Agon, had been deliberately cultivated by the early counts of Savoy as a source of sacral legitimacy. A safe conduct obtained from Charles of Durazzo allowed the Savoyard knights to convey the body first to Pozzuoli in Campania and then by sea to Hautecombe, where it was interred with solemn ceremony on May the 8th, or the following day. Pozzuoli, the ancient port of Puteoli, provided a convenient embarkation point on the Tyrrhenian Sea for the long sea voyage back to the Western Mediterranean, ensuring that the Count's remains returned to the dynastic necropolis despite the distances involved. By Bon of Bourbon, Amadeus had 3 children, an unnamed daughter born in 1358 who lived only a few weeks, sadly as commonly enough, Amadeus who succeeded as Amadeus VII, and Louis, born late in 1364, who died, however, before the end of the year as well. So 3 legitimate sons and daughters as well. Antonio, who died in 1374, Giovanna and Antonietta are also recorded in the sources. The legitimate children were provided with suitable marriages or ecclesiastical careers following the customary practice of 14th century princely houses that sought to absorb collateral lines without threatening the legitimate succession, of course. So you have understood here like the complexity. I specialize in early 14th century history, but when it comes to the mid 14th century, there is like paradoxically, you feel that the complexity of the crisis, the collapse, the complicated. Looking at these figures, expeditions, their general goals, like all these administrative problems, but also their ideals. Think about also the chivalric foundations, the spiritual background. We should really make more videos about spirituality, medieval spirituality, because so they're tendentially studied in historiography from mostly a sociological standpoint, right? Communities, but what about the leaders? How did they see actually? You know that obviously we do this a lot on Schwerpunkt through videos about traditional history of religions, of spirituality. But there are some times, like if you dig into these guys' biography, you have all these sort of composite set of beliefs, of practices, of symbolism, as you've seen here, like the different holy places that are also pretty old. There is a massive traditional legacy that runs through generations, all the archetypal symbols, protector saints, heraldic meaning attached to the greater chivalric reforms in knightly orders. Very particular time, very difficult one, as a matter of fact. I'm really glad that we covered the Green Count because, as we said before, we really need more videos about Savoy. It has, again, an incredible importance. And we really have to go step by step because without this patience, you can't really cover, well, the whole picture. Under Amadeus's 40-year rule, the Count of Savoy acquired a compact and defensible territorial shape, an imperial vicariate that enhanced its juridical independence, a network of carefully balanced alliances stretching from the Western Alps to the Levant and southern Italy, and an administrative and chivalric apparatus capable of sustaining the ambitions of the dynasty for generations to come. Really, this is really a long reign, which was relatively unusual, as you see here, also through all the dynastic issues of the minorities. That was the case also why Amadeus's reign was so long, but in general, right? It's really decades of wars, of expeditions, of feuds, of general political international recognition. You have different phases here, also in local Italian politics, imperial, succession, papal, curia, so the relations with France, the 100 Years' War. It's really a lot of stuff. If you realize, even in just a couple of hours here, that we described how much did this man go through, which was, not nothing, but let's say something even minor compared to other ancestors, right? Amadeus V was a hell of a figure, for example, but there were other great ancestors as well. So again, Savoy is in this broader northwestern frontier of the former Kingdom of Ireland. It's a bit of a forgotten world that I think studying the history of Savoy in particular really becomes much clearer and sort of much more relevant in our eyes. So that on it's obvious that the dream of every medievalist, especially as you start studying the Middle Ages and you don't feel the fact that you're aging yet, you think you have an infinite time in front of you to learn everything, right? And so ideally what is really about the Middle Ages, at least that fascinated me in many ways, is truly trying to understand it, learning every single thing that was happening at the time. You don't have this level of detailed history for classical antiquity, right? You do know that similar things existed, but you just don't know that. We don't have the evidence. About the Middle Ages, it's messy, but it's also organic. It's also comprehensive. It's also overall understandable. And again, studying the mid-14th century is depressing. That's a reason. There is a reason why I stopped just chronologically to study, to research at least professionally to the Black Death period, basically. But it's also perhaps one of the most forgotten and actually incredibly fascinating times. They're really open to the affirmation of the ancien regime, also to these powers that eventually would have risen, in fact, to be among the sort of more strategically relevant in Europe as well. But it's really a hinge, right? There are two different eras that lives like the one of the Green Count stretches, that it's really that relevant to really look at these figures. Besides, biographies are crucial because they really do tell you step by step how the whole thing was made, as opposed to study just the place and what happened to it. Yes, that's very important. The historical original series we will have to resume briefly, but let's say the action, the agency, the level of direct involvement, commitment, etc. It's all incredibly relevant, and that's the reason also why we'll be continuing on this path. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.